Hi there, I'm Deep Dhillon. Welcome to your AI Injection, the podcast where we discuss state-of-the-art techniques in artificial intelligence with a focus on how these capabilities are used to transform organizations, making them more efficient, impactful, and successful.
So what are we talking about today?
Yeah, so we'll just roll into it. Hey, thanks everybody for joining. I've got Bill here. So this is the two of us are going to talk about assessing efficacy or accuracy in these large language models. Let's kind of dig in here, because one of the things that happens with these LLMs, is you get a lot of it's very easy to kind of get carried away and get them to say things, and you can quite quickly get them to do something that seems an awful lot like what you're trying to go after. But everyone seems to kind of be coming around to the fact that GPT-4 is, I think you call it God at this point, but it's really, really good. And as you're pointing out, folks now are just sort of using it for training data. So if, for summarization, you got a bunch of stuff that you maybe pass into GPT-4, or maybe it's like the CNN corpus that everyone kind of knows at this point, where you've got reporters who've actually, humans that have summarized this content. But once you've got that, maybe we'd start with what are some of the old school techniques that people were doing to assess efficacy for a task really specific like that, where you've got text that's being generated. How do you actually even say how well it's adhering to the sort of
that's a
perfect definition? Why don't we start there, and then we can talk about some of the newer techniques and what GPT-4 makes possible.
So let's go old school. You and I can ramble a little bit, and we are gonna sound pretty old here. Ultimately, it comes down to, if you take a blob of text and you have one of these models summarize it in some way, it's gonna return an answer. Let's call that the bot answer. But then you're gonna have a ground truth. Maybe that ground truth actually comes from a human being who's done the same thing. As you mentioned, for example, there are some articles out there where they have a whole article and the author summarized that entire article in just another sentence, and you can so download that corpus of text, for example. But ultimately, you have a bot's answer and you have a human's answer, or you have a ground truth answer. And you need to compare them somehow. So you can say, well, the bot's answer was actually close or really far away. So if we're going really, really old school, you would literally do like a string comparison between those things. Without going into the weeds there's lots of little techniques like Levenstein distance and so forth. Essentially, you're calculating distance metrics between those things. But then later on, we got this idea, when you deal with text, you have to turn it into numbers so that we can deal with it in a machine learning sense. And there was a technique that came out there that formed these so-called word embeddings by Nicholas Somov was I think the first. I hope I have his name correct. He was the first one to sort of publish a real seminal paper on this. Writing in the back to a lot of technology, but basically it would take a given word and form a numeric vector. And so you could do this, you could think of it if I have sentence A and sentence B and you want to compare them, you would take the word vectors and sort of compare them and see how close they are. But the problem with that is that doesn't really tell you so much about context.
Before we get in there, I want to make sure, for our listeners' benefit, what we're trying to do here is you've got a human that supposedly gave you the perfect summary, and you've got a bot that created a summary, and you're trying to find out how close to the perfect summary. Maybe it isn't even always human, because lately we've been using a lot more GPT-4 for the summaries because they're better than the humans that we've got. But you've got a perfect summary quote, and then you've got this one that you're trying to measure its distance to perfect, which in and of itself is sort of flawed, right? Because you can imagine multiple summaries that are great, and it's hard to know whether or not one's perfect over the other. But that is sort of the premise that we're marching forward on. And then part of what you're describing is that similarity process, how do you determine how similar to the quote perfect yours is? And then there's various techniques from like simple string comparisons, like like edit distance or Levenstein, where you're just how many characters does it take to move one to the other, which of course doesn't really account for like things like synonyms. And then we talk about word embeddings, which we've talked about on this program before. Where we've got now a semantic understanding of words based on these more sophisticated models that can predict like future word sequences. And now we have even more powerful techniques where we're predicting future sentences, and we get what we think of as sentence embeddings or semantic understandings of the sentence, all of which kind of give you a similarity, all of which let you basically say like how close to the perfect are you. But before we go on, let's kind of talk a little bit about what we're assuming there and how applicable in real life scenarios that is. Because how do you get that perfect stuff that you're comparing against for one? Two, like how is that variability across perfect even expressed, or is it even the right modality? And sometimes you get things that semantically seem really quite good, but maybe you violate some kind of unwritten or some kind of like rule. So like let's say it's HIPAA sensitive data. Maybe it's like providing medical advice or something like that, where maybe semantically that's still a perfect answer, but it's still wrong. Like how do we think through these things?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. When it comes right down to it, it's not only a task-driven exercise where you have a very specific thing that you're doing, like take this blob of text and summarize it, but it's also you as a person that's developing a product, you might have these constraints that, for example, you can't have city names or personal names. You can't have any PII. It has to be a certain length, for example. That's something that's quite common. You may want, for example, something that's maybe tweet size, and so it's something quite small. Maybe you even want it down to like a couple buzzwords, so it's more, edging towards like keywords. So in this sense, the efficacy of the model, it's not enough for it to be very accurate in some sense. Like say it has a good sentence embedding approximation between the two are very close. It's also that it adheres to these constraints that you've put up. And the only way really to put up the boundaries for these models to adhere to those constraints is for you to do typically some sort of fine tuning. Um, and I just want to point out that it's important to have all these different metrics. And you think that these string metrics are kind of silly, but actually when you talk about very, very short responses, you might want to include like a string matching. When you talk about longer responses, you might want to include, string sentence embeddings or even word embeddings and so forth. But you also might want to bring in, as we just said, measures of how close they adhere to whatever you're trying to achieve, like length. You might have a length, metric, and you might have something like, well, does this thing return something with PII in it? Does it return something that's kind of cheeky in its response, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, you might have various fuzzy things, right? Like one of the things people realize really quickly with the default settings in ChatGPT is it tends to get kind of preachy, and it tends to just barf advice at you in like very large volumes unless you control it more. And that's often like something like, folks who are trying to tweak these outputs, they have their idea of quote perfect, right? And it's very editorially driven in some sense, like it's not that different from a magazine in the in a decade prior or something, or even today, but like where an editor had a real voice and really specific ideas of what they wanted to express. And those things, if we think about classical text analysis with machine learning, like normal precision recall metrics don't really like apply exactly. These similarity to perfect metrics are a new way of thinking about things because it's very sort of granular in some sense. Like you can define perfect at the granular setting, but when you start talking about bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger summaries, that complexity gets bigger. And if you got like, five let's say, of the key editors in a room, do you get agreement? So all of those become challenges in this space.
Well, and then you mentioned one thing is that how does one go about the business of forming a ground truth here? Like, what is your gold? What are you comparing to? What is your standard? Conventionally, we at Psionics, and I think people typically would just grab humans. You would have the discussion, right? Like editors in the room. Hey, when we put out this material, this is the content that we're looking for. This is how we're going to communicate it and so forth. So you have that same sort of discussions around this material for a specific project. So it's important to point out here is not only are you looking for things that we talked about, like it has to match in terms of context and length, maybe, but even attitude, because you might be speaking to an audience that's young teenagers who are not going to want a formal response. So you might be looking for summaries that are more, like colloquial, like, hey, a lot of haze or dude or what. I'm too old to understand modern, teenage talk, but
Yeah, the discourse style is
discourse.
something that
Thank you. Yeah.
on some level you want to almost decouple that too, though,
Yes,
right?
you
Like
do.
that's also part of this is like with respect to efficacy assessment,
Yes.
you may not want to commingle discourse style because it sort of pollutes uh, your metric on some level.
Or you may want to include it because that's the only style of communication that you're looking for, So, but I guess what you ultimately is from a sort of like an analytical perspective, is you have these different dimensions by which you can assess equality between essentially two strings, One is the gold standard provided by what you would think of as a human. This is what we're going for. This is what the editors sort of think is the best response, or the best summary. And then what, say, one of these models spat out. And you have these different dimensions that, could be context, could be length, it could be, how cheeky it is, attitude, etc. These things are difficult. Some of them are difficult to actually measure, but you can get close, right? And you can do you could then you have sort of these different scores and these different dimensions. And what I personally do is I will form an overall score, an efficacy score, say, based on a weighted average of all of those dimensions. So I'll say, it's very important for me that the context be very close. So I'm going to give that score, whatever that is, like a 5 of a weight.
Yeah, there's some kind of combination there, but you might not know like what what's the ratio between cheekiness and accuracy,
Yeah, when it comes to attitude, that's very difficult to assess.
Well, not only attitude though. It's things like, if you're building a whatever, like a virtual, like a career, like therapist or something. Like how empathetic is it? Basically, what we're getting at is like measuring, like quantifying these editorial activities that historically have been very playbook driven and in the hands of quite creative folks that don't think quite as um, like like metric, like in such a specific metric orientation like geeks like we do. And so that's almost like there's like a big gap there, right? Because historically it would be like, hey, you're an investigative reporter, go do your thing. And then we're interacting at this very high level. Now we're talking about this thing that can converse and trying to like, and it maybe it's not even conversational, right? Like we were talking about summarization, but it's like writing, basically assessing writing is what we're talking about, against a very granular attributes, sort of laid against an editorial construct of some sort.
I do want to point out that we haven't quite moved the timeline here up to the current standard. What we've discussed thus far, let's say when we're talking about a world of sort of like GTP3 and prior models, these are LLMs that aren't quite as sophisticated as the current models are. We definitely would involve the editorial board, as you said. We would involve humans. We would say, we have annotators, for example, at Zionics that we use, and we say, here's a blob of text. If I were to tell you to summarize this in a single sentence, Go ahead and generate that. And we talk to them, right? We train them. We say, here are the types of things we're looking for. We want proper grammar. We want it to be a certain
Yeah,
length.
we come up with really specific guidelines too.
Yes, yeah.
Typically, like brutal documents with detailed examples and things like this is on this side of the boundary or that
That's right.
side.
In the past, you could also steer the models towards that direction, right? You could try to essentially give it prompts, so to speak, and maybe in that prompt, you can give it an example of what you're looking for so it has a good idea. And you could see it could lock onto that prompt and that example quite nicely. Now, in the current standard, which is GTP4, you have these things almost like you tell it the type of assistant that you would like to generate. Like you say, hey, I'm a principal in a school district and I want to be able to communicate better with my parents. And so, start from that attitude, start from that position and then do your stuff forward from that. Maybe the forward from that are instructions. I'd like you to summarize these large documents and put it in simple language that I can more easily communicate to the parents, etc. And I will tell you that that technique and that approach got so good from my perspective that it actually was beating humans.
You're listening to your AI injection brought to you by Xionyx.com. That's XYONIX.com. Check out our website for more content or if you need help injecting AI into your organization. And taking the conversation back to efficacy assessment, one of the things we know that some of these higher level models like ChatGPT are so good at is you can very easily with like a few examples come up with like a categorization scheme or a scoring scheme. So let's talk for a moment about actually just using the model to itself to assess efficacy along different axes. Like you mentioned like offensiveness. There's things like empathy. There's a number of attributes. So if we go back to the editorial aspect, you can imagine an editorial guideline coming up with we are gonna always be whatever empathetic, clear in our response, non-offensive, yet edgy. And you can imagine just like you have like an old stereo dial where you've got you're sort of got different abilities to light up those attributes. Now you can go back and very easily use these models themselves to assess for a given generation how offensive are you, how edgy were you, etc. And so let's talk about that. Like what does that mean? Because it's like you're using the same model to generate your stuff, or maybe like it's not quite. I mean, it's the same model, but maybe different prompting or whatever.
That's the way I look at it. It's the same giant model with a billion capabilities. It's an idiot savant, right? It can do yeah, like it can do most anything that has to do with communication of human beings. Coding, speaking in French, writing a business plan. It does a million things well, actually. Um, and steering it back to this conversation, I love talking to you, Deep, about this because we're kind of old school folks, right? If we were to say, look, we want these completions, these things coming back from the models to whatever they say, we want them to have these characteristics as you suggested. Empathy, they want to be inspirational, they want to be clear, they want to be edgy. Imagine, say, even last year, for us to be able to take any given sentence and then go along these different dimensions to say, well, how empathetic was it? How clear was this? How edgy is this response? Because these are the things, these are the check boxes that you're looking for in those responses. So part of the efficacy in your model could be almost what we call like communication traits, right? We want the model to be able to communicate the information in a particular way. And here are the ways. We want it to be edgy, etc. But then to actually give that a number, imagine that we had to do that. So what you do is like you say, that these LLMs and particularly GTP4 is so good that you can go back and say, well, look, why don't you give me a rating on empathy for this response? And you can even say to it, give me a number.
I mean, I think this is really a big deal. So, like, many of our users are product managers or folks who build, sophisticated products. And the question I always ask myself when I'm talking about efficacy is, like, the scenario I want to avoid is some high-powered executive, whatever, storms into the room and says, "This thing stinks on this in this case, and fix it," and expects you as if it's all a big if-then, you're just going to jump into some specific line of code and like fix something. That's obviously, we all know that's not how these systems work. So we need statistically meaningful test suites as product managers, as founders and people who are like pushing this technology and integrating it into their products. We need statistically meaningful ways of feeling confident when we release, and being able to stand up to that, high power exec that's freaking about the one example that they think is terrible, which is inevitable and definitely will happen and keep happening. So that's where I think I always imagine myself like, I'm about to release this thing. I need to have a methodology, some stats that I can bubble up and I can crisply say, why we released this thing, and I need to have those knobs and dials there that make sense to the exec walking into the room. So the knob and dial in this case is like, well, what do you want to set the edginess level to? What do you want to set the aggressiveness level to? And this is, we now ran against these, 50,000, kind of curated candidates, like, and now we run the model against it with these curated, ideal answers, and we got this score using the kind of, let's call it proximity to perfect, but we also got these scores on these axes, and somehow we bubbled it all up into a single score, but everything we can track back and describe, because it's like a moving target. We're always going to want to change things a little bit, and I don't know, like, to me that seems like where we're headed here is a world where you can assemble an efficacy score based on like high level knobs and dials that you can, through experience and exposure to the soft spots there, tweak over time, but you can always link it back.
Well, I think what you're saying is super important. We began this conversation with how do you control these beasts? And we have certain dials and ways of doing so as best we can. But then I think probably the most important aspect of our conversations here is how do you measure the beast? We've talked about efficacy. I almost think of these traits that your efficacy to me is more along the line is I tend to think of things more along the line is the information coming back correct and presented in a sort of a decent fashion, like the length is suitable for text, etc. Then I almost feel like there's a communication trait and alignment with those. Like, did you give an empathetic response? Was it clear, etc. These other attributes. I kind of tend to divide up those territories into two different realms. And the reason I do that is because let's imagine, just this is a bit abstract, but imagine that there's information to be had out there in the world, and you're assuming at this point that that's very accurate. But now you want to disseminate that information effectively. Well, that information being disseminated to an old professor in Oxford probably is going to be put one way, whereas disseminated to a young teenager who's very sassy and doesn't like his parents at the time might be disseminated another way, etc. Right? And in order, I think I almost call this communication alignment because we also have the ability now to communicate with people in sort of these different ways. And we can actually, as you suggest, we can actually measure specifically how aligned we are with those communication strategies. And that's super important to, I think, people and managers out there who are building a product. And they say, hey, we mainly deal with, professionals and doctors, so we're not going to want cheeky responses. We're going to want very formal, etc. Or you might be dealing with the general public, and maybe you're targeting teenagers for like advertising or whatever. I don't know. it's very important that we be able to measure these sort of communication strategies. And with these large language models, in a nutshell, you can do so. I would say that in our experience, we have done so. And uh, like most things with GTP4, we're somewhat blown away, maybe not getting as blown away anymore because we sort of expect it to be incredible at these efforts. But there are cases where in some of these dimensions, we can see maybe its own assessment is maybe a little bit off according to what we might think. Like maybe it says, for example, that this wasn't very clear. Gives it a score of 0.1 out of 1. But we go back and say, you know what? Actually, I thought that was very, very clear. Um, so we so what I think that speaks to a larger issue that we haven't yet touched on is we can always go to God and say, please do what our bidding. But we can also, one of the things I brought up earlier is that that's not very scalable in terms of cost and computational speed.
Just to be clear for our audience, Bill likes to call GPT-4 God, but like no offense intended.
But I mean that in yeah, in a non-offensive way. It's let's just call it a very uh, huge single source of information.
That high probability of correctness,
Yeah,
or at least reasonableness.
yes. Well, anyway, you can take these huge models and large language models, and you can bring them down to a lower level model and use GTP4 to basically generate training data.
I think part of what you're saying here is if we rewind 6 months ago, maybe even, like a good chunk of our outputs, we were kind of satisfied by saying this is good or bad, correct or not. Now fast forward to now, we're in a world where almost everything these things say are reasonable. So now we're trying to get to perfect responses. And so perfect means assessing them in a more holistic way. And now we're sort of struggling with like what are the efficacy metrics one uses to be able to do that. I want to take a little bit of, I think this has been a super interesting discussion, but I want to jump out, let's say 5 or 10 years into the future, and I want to ask the question like, what does the world look like with respect to this, how we actually interact and define these things, and how do we assess efficacy like 5, 10 years out? Because it feels to me like there are certain areas that are going to get quite mature now, where startups, whoever is going to get, are going to get really good at helping. So, for example, I'm envisioning a tool that's like a workflow tool that can take a set of people that are on the editorial committee of some dialogue system, for example, and it can get really good at interacting with them, getting them to debate the issues, figure out exactly what this response, where this response is suboptimal and why, how it could be better, facilitates agreement amongst them, and then manifests itself in revised entry in examples for efficacy assessment, or in like more fine-tuning examples, something like that. Like that's sort of one example of 5 years out. I imagine somebody's done really well at that, has gotten it so that it's like a few clicks and, and five folks can like steer this thing pretty quickly. Are there like, do you see, like, what do you see five years out?
Well, first of all, it's scary to think about 5 years out for me. And I want to. I think it's an important point because maybe 2 years out. I mean, at the rate that we are,
Maybe 6 months out. Bec-
no, and totally. I mean, I think we're totally. I think we have. I don't want to get off track here, but we have gone over the top of the mountain now, and we are fast. I mean, there are, as you say, there are so many people that have latched on to the possibilities. So there's just a lot more folks using these LLMs. And I personally, I think where we're headed, where I guess I would like to see us head, is in developing these communication strategies that are very personalized. Everybody in the earth has a particular way of communicating and a particular style. So I see these models being highly personalized, in a couple of years to the degree that satisfies most people. I think I've mentioned a couple times, maybe in a former podcast, I see a day not long from now where I literally wake up and go in the mirror and it's like, oh, Bill, how are you doing today? And I have a conversation with them and it uses computer vision to recognize that it's me. Whereas my wife comes in soon after me and it's, well, hello, how are you doing?
Different way
Different
of
way.
interacting.
So I do think that what we're talking about is the ability to switch personas essentially in communicating basic level information in a way that not only is relevant to the current day, but maybe your entire history, how you have been, maybe you're not, maybe for example, you've been feeling down for the last 6 months so that it takes on a more empathetic tone and so forth.
But efficacy assessment in that world, in that hyper personalized world, is challenging, right? Because now you're almost like assessing efficacy relative to a set of dials and all their potential parameters. And now you're just setting the parameters back for the individual or something. So in other words, I have the ability to say to like be a 10 on the empathy dial and a 6 on the aggressiveness and that's because that's what I want and that's how I want to be talked to, and there's a separate system that figures that out. But now I have another system that can assess, like, given that I'm trying to get a 6, 7, 8, 3 across these attributes output, I now generated it. To what extent did I adhere to that? That might be your efficacy assessment in that world.
That's right. But we haven't talked about, well, what happens when we have an assessment of the typical responses? Are they adhering? Are they aligning to these communication traits or not? What do we do about it when it's not? I think that in a couple of years, there will be the ability for us to steer these models um, even more so than we have today. Because right now, to be honest with you, I think we're steering. I think OpenAI's, this is my view, is that they were able to steer it enough to be able to release it to the general public. But now it's going to be a game of personalization. Can you steer it towards something that you like?
Well, we're almost, I think we're out of time here. It's been super fun chatting and digging in on all things LLM and efficacy assessments. Although we, as always, we kind of meander off into other related areas and some kind of off into further out, but that's kind of part of the fun here on your AI injection. So thanks for a great conversation, Bill, and thanks to our audience and for being here. And feel free for those online to, we've got a lot of content, articles that kind of are more structured and in depth than what you get conversationally. But we also have a lot of podcast episodes that touch on things that are quite related to this topic. So feel free to go to zionics.com and poke around in our articles or podcast section, or drop us a card or letter if you've got anything that you want to add to the conversation. So thanks everybody, and we'll see you next time. That's all for this episode. I'm Dhillon, your host, saying check back soon for your next AI injection. In the meantime, if you need help injecting AI into your business, reach out to us at Zionics.com. That's XYONIX.com. Whether it's text, audio, video, or other business data, we help all kinds of organizations like yours automatically find and operationalize transformative insights.